Thank you, Jaipur, for having us, and thank you, all of you, for spending some time with us this afternoon. I am honored and delighted to be in conversation with Patrick. He is, to my mind, one of the most important writers of our times. And I think some of the work that he has done has been so inspiring to me personally, but I also know so many other writers and journalists who've taken inspiration from him. And today we are talking about his story, one of the stories that he's written in his book Empire of Pain, and previously as an article for The New Yorker, which is again one of the most disturbing stories of our times, the story of the opioid crisis in America and how it sort of went unchecked for a very, very long period of time. Just a quick show of hands. How many of you are aware of the story? Do you know what the story is? Excellent. That's a lot of you, and that'll save us some time trying to explain the ins and outs of this story. So I will get right to it. Patrick, thank you for being here. And what I suppose I need to start with is it is, of course, one of the most important stories of our times, but there was a fair bit of writing on the opioid crisis when you decided to do the article and then eventually make it into a book. What drew you to this story, and what did you feel was missing from the narrative?
Thank you, Pragya, and thank you all for being here. It's a huge thrill to be with you. I've actually been to Jaipur before. I was here in 2007 reporting a New Yorker story, but never to the festival before. This is an amazing event, and it's a real honor to be able to play a part in it. So yes, for those of you who didn't raise your hands, the opioid crisis is this sort of ongoing public health crisis in the United States that started really in the 1990s, and then over the course of nearly 3 decades has killed a very large number of people due to addiction and overdose. Nobody knows exactly how many people, but probably more than about 600,000 people have died during that period of time, which makes it really one of the leading causes of death in the United States. More people have died from overdoses than have died in car accidents, in gunshot deaths, which, as you know, is sort of the statistic that generally the United States surpasses in. And there were a couple of books on this phenomenon, which really started as a prescription drug crisis in the 1990s. You had these opioid painkillers, which were a chemical cousin of heroin, but were prescribed by doctors and approved by the FDA. And a whole generation of Americans became addicted to these drugs. This is really starting in the mid-1990s. And eventually what happened is a lot of those people migrated. They'd become addicted already, and they migrated over to heroin, and then eventually to fentanyl, which many of you have probably heard about, which is really the crisis right now, which is very, very deadly and still killing a lot of people, more than 100,000 people last year. When I started work on this, I had actually become interested in it because I'd been writing about the illegal drug trade. I'd been writing about Mexican drug cartels, and I noticed that the business of these cartels was affected by the big pharma industry, essentially, that you had all these people who'd become addicted to these supposedly legitimate doctor-prescribed drugs who suddenly wanted to buy heroin on the black market, and the Mexican drug cartels were supplying more heroin. And that was really interesting to me. And as I read the literature as it existed at the time, you know, it's a very complicated public health crisis, but the thing that fascinated me most is that the origin story of the opioid crisis was actually pretty explicable. It was pretty legible. If you go back to the mid-1990s, it really starts with one drug, which is a drug called OxyContin. And it was that drug and the way it was marketed that got all of these people addicted who hadn't been before. And it turned out that OxyContin was sold by this company, Purdue Pharma, which is a small, privately held pharmaceutical company. And Purdue Pharma was owned by a family, the Sackler family. And that was the way in for me. That was the thing I found most intriguing, was that there was this one family that had really helped create this crisis, which had gone on to kill hundreds of thousands of people. And I'm always interested in ethical questions, and I'm interested in stories about family, and so that was what drew me in.
You spend a good amount of time in the book writing about Arthur Sackler, who is sort of the patriarchal figure of the Sackler family. But he doesn't just, to my mind, provide the backdrop for the family. He also creates the blueprint for the crisis that is to come in the 90s, and in that sense is a sort of Frankensteinian figure. Could you tell us a little bit about who Arthur Sackler was?
Yeah, of course. So I think of myself as writing narrative nonfiction. So the stories are always true. When I publish things in the New Yorker magazine, they have to be very carefully fact-checked. I hire a fact-checker to fact-check my books when I publish the books. And yet, ideally, I want these stories to read like a novel. I want you to feel as though you're absorbed by the narrative qualities of the tale and by the characters. And the tricky thing about that, of course, is because you can't make anything up in this kind of writing, you really, on some level, are at the mercy of who the characters are, who you find. Sometimes you're writing a story and the people at the heart of the story are fundamentally quite boring. And that's a real challenge for a writer of nonfiction. But in the case of Arthur Sackler, it's occasionally the case that you stumble on somebody who's just a great character, a character with real novelistic qualities. And I think of Arthur Sackler as somebody, it's as if he'd walked out of the pages of a Saul Bellow novel. He was this incredible kind of mid-century American figure. He grew up in Brooklyn about a century ago. His parents were both immigrants. They'd come from Central Europe at the turn of the last century. And he was the oldest of three brothers. And they grew up in this immigrant family in Brooklyn with big dreams, and the parents wanted the boys to be doctors. He later said that by the age of 4, he knew that he was going to be a doctor because he knew that this is what his mother wanted for him. And he did grow up to be a doctor, but he was this kind of protean, creative, restless, ambitious figure who wanted more than just to practice medicine. He was very interested in business. And when he was in medical school, he had worked on the side as a copywriter, writing advertising copy. And so Arthur Sackler comes out of medical school, and this is in the period just following the Second World War, when you had really the birth of big pharma as we know it today. All of these companies, which previously had mainly dealt in generic drugs, suddenly they were creating these branded drugs, new branded drugs every week, and they needed advertisers to help distinguish them in the minds of consumers. And so Arthur Sackler becomes this kind of advertising maven. If any of you have seen the American television series Mad Men, I sometimes joke that Arthur Sackler was kind of the Don Draper of medical advertising in the 1940s. He was a real genius at selling drugs. And he knew that the real trick with selling drugs is it's not actually the consumer that you need to persuade, it's the doctor who's writing the prescription. And so he devised this incredible set of tools for selling these drugs. He started his own pharmaceutical advertising firm, which became very successful. Or I should say he joined an advertising firm and then quickly took it over and owned it. And he made the first great Sackler fortune marketing Valium, which was the blockbuster drug of its day. This is in the 1960s. He became enormously rich marketing Valium, and making, it turned out, a whole series of claims about Valium that were not true in terms of its benefits, and then also downplaying a lot of the side effects. For instance, the idea that you could get addicted. And so this is a story, the book, Empire of Pain, is a story in which a bunch of things happen twice. And you find, for instance, with Valium, that there's a whole generation of Americans who become addicted to Valium. And Arthur Sackler gets very rich, and this is sort of something that people don't really acknowledge at first. And part of the reason they don't acknowledge it, and his role in it, is that as soon as he starts making money, Arthur Sackler starts giving it away. And he gave money to universities, he gave money to museums, all these elite cultural and educational institutions, and always with a condition, which was, I will give you this generous gift, and in exchange, you have to put my name on the wall, or my name on the exhibition hall, or my name on the front of the building. And this is another thing that really intrigued me about this story is when I first got started and I learned about the Sackler family owning this company, I knew that name because I grew up in Boston and I worked for a year after high school in Harvard Square, and I would go to the Sackler Museum at Harvard. And I moved to England, and the Sackler name is all over London, the British Museum, the Tate, everywhere. There was a Sackler wing at the Louvre. I moved to Washington, D.C., and in Washington, D.C., there was a Sackler gallery on the mall. And so I actually knew this Sackler name, but I didn't know the source of that wealth.
So moving to the next generation, a very quick recap. Patrick mentioned that what set off the opioid crisis in America was this drug called OxyContin. Its predecessor was MS-Contin, which was prescribed largely to cancer patients for pain management. And the next generation after Arthur Sackler essentially creates OxyContin, which is a much stronger painkiller. The idea is that it is a timed release capsule, so it has a coating that assures that you are sort of microdosing on it throughout the day or whatever the period might be in which the medicine lasts. And this coincides with them becoming evangelists for moderate to severe pain management, insisting that pain is something that's overlooked by doctors. And this sort of gets bought into. Now, how the story plays out is very, very interesting. It's the stuff of Empire of Pain, and if you haven't read the book, I urge you to read it and get more into the story. But for this conversation, we will consider this story in three parts. The first part is the approval of the drug. Now, when the drug is created, clearly it has potential for abuse and addiction, but it is passed by the FDA. I'm curious to know if that is institutional weakness, failure, corruption. What do you make of the passing, the unchecked approval that it receives from the FDA? And is it sort of symptomatic of a larger rot, or is it particular to this story?
So the big thing that changes with OxyContin, the way in which it fundamentally changes the game, is that humans have known that the opium poppy produces medicine which can be extremely effective at easing pain for thousands of years. That's something that we've known for millennia. But we've also known that there's another aspect of these drugs, which is that they can be very habit-forming. They can be very addictive. And as a consequence, in the United States, certainly, generations of physicians would use drugs like morphine very sparingly. You know, that they had access to these drugs, but it was like the remedy you kept on the top shelf, and you only reached for it when other things were not effective, were not working. You often heard about morphine being used in the treatment of cancer pain, in end-of-life situations, where you wouldn't worry about the risk of addiction. OxyContin kind of changed all that because it was a chemical cousin of morphine, very, very powerful, but as you said, it had this time release mechanism. So you could take a huge dose, and the idea was it would slowly filter into your bloodstream over the course of 12 hours. And the Sackler family, when they were promoting the drug, they essentially claimed that because of this slow time release, it wouldn't be addictive. So for thousands of years, we've known that these drugs can ease pain, but also that they can be addictive. And the claim that Purdue Pharma made was, well, until now, because we've hacked it. We've found a way to uncouple the good side, therapeutically, from the bad side. Now, they had no real basis for believing this, and in fact, there were no studies that showed this, and indeed, some of the studies that they did before they released the drug indicated that it could be quite habit-forming, but they cruised through the FDA. And I think there are a variety of reasons for that. Part of what this book is about, in my view, is the incredible power of private money to influence public institutions. So part of the issue is that you had a wealthy pharmaceutical company that was in a position to essentially lobby the agency that was regulating it. And there's what I think of as soft corruption. So when we say corruption, you think I slide an envelope of money across the table to you. And certainly that kind of corruption exists in the United States, in India, all over the world. But I was really struck by a kind of softer corruption in which you work at the FDA, I work in the pharmaceutical industry. Your job is to regulate me, and we have a meeting. And the thing is that you have children, and you have a mortgage that you're paying on your home, and you know that someday your kids are going to need to go to college, and you're very, very educated, and you're very, very smart, but the government doesn't pay you that much. And you know that someday you might want to leave, and you might want to get a job in the private sector. I don't even need to give you an envelope of money. All I have to say to you is, so how long have you been in the government? And how long were you thinking of staying? Well, if you ever come out, you might want to look us up. And in the case of OxyContin, there was a guy named Curtis Wright, who was the head official at the FDA, whose job it was to regulate the drug, to decide whether it worked and whether it was safe. And Curtis Wright ended up signing off on OxyContin. He signed off on the bogus marketing claims about how the drug would not be addictive. And then after the drug was released and it became the blockbuster drug of its day, it soon generated billions of dollars a year, Curtis Wright decided that it was time for him to leave government. He might want to get a job in the private sector. Show of hands, who can guess where he ended up working? And he left and ended up working at Purdue Pharma for 3 times his government salary. And I should say, there is nothing illegal about that. I haven't found anybody who would justify that arrangement. I think most people looking at it would say, well, that kind of stinks. It seems a little iffy. Certainly when I reached Curtis Wright on the phone, he didn't have anything much to say for himself. We talked for about 30 seconds before he hung up on me. But that kind of thing happens, I think, every day, not just in the pharmaceutical industry, but actually across the whole spectrum of regulatory agencies, where there's a kind of soft corruption which is very, very difficult to legislate against.
The second part to this story, of course, is the way the drug is now approved, it's in the market, and the Sackler family takes on this very aggressive marketing campaign. Again, following Arthur's model and marketing the drug primarily to doctors. And it's nothing, to my mind, nothing like what the pharma industry has seen before. Could you tell us a little bit about how they approach marketing, but also, once again, about does this reek again of regulatory failure? Because we live in times when we need to put stickers on processed food about whether they contain nuts or whether they're vegetarian or vegan and so on. And yet, we have this story that we're talking about where marketing mavens were running around the country selling this drug to doctors who've studied science, making very, very dubious claims about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. So Arthur Sackler dies, that character I mentioned before, in the 1980s. He dies years before OxyContin is even introduced. But part of what appealed to me about this story is it's a real family saga. So he had 2 brothers, and they had children, and there end up being 3 generations. And so it's the rest of the Sackler family that brings out OxyContin. And when they do, they're using this playbook that Arthur designed. And the idea is that you sort of flood the zone in terms of your marketing. And in fact, when OxyContin was released, they had all of these marketing people who would go out and press the drug on doctors, on pharmacists, on others. And it was the biggest team of sales representatives that had ever been sent forth to sell a drug. And again, you get what I think of as a kind of soft corruption. So in this case, they went out. They made the pitch to doctors. A lot of the time what they would do is they would say, you know, doc, we're actually having a symposium on pain management, and it's going to be in Florida in February. And we'd like you to come down for an all-expenses-paid weekend and play a little golf and see a few presentations. When they found doctors who were prescribing a lot of OxyContin, they would say, we'd like you to speak at this kind of event, and in fact, we'll pay you really well to give these speeches about how much you like OxyContin, because one of the things Arthur Sackler knew was a doctor is more likely to sort of take the marketing pitch if it comes from another doctor. There may be physicians out there in the audience today, and I will say that I've had many conversations with doctors over the years who will say to me, oh, well, I know that the pharmaceutical companies, they do all this stuff. They buy me a steak dinner, but you could never change the way I prescribe. I wouldn't be bought so cheaply. You could never change the way I prescribe just by buying me a meal. So I got all of these internal documents from Purdue Pharma, thousands and thousands of pages of internal company documents. And what's really interesting is you see their side of it, which is how much money they're spending to send these doctors on these junkets, how much money they're spending on food. At the height of OxyContin's sales, Purdue Pharma was spending $9 million a year just to buy food for doctors. And they would look at the return on investment on each dollar. So it's this interesting thing where a lot of the physicians would say, oh yeah, I went down, I went on a nice all expenses paid weekend, but of course it would never change the way I prescribe. But we know that it does. And in fact, they would say, oh, it's interesting, if you spend $1 on a weekend buying food for a doctor, it'll actually change the rate of prescribing even more dramatically than if you spend it during the week. And so, again, none of this is illegal, which points to the second part of your question, right? Should this be more aggressively regulated? Absolutely. There are countries, many, many countries, that are more aggressively regulated than the United States is. I actually don't know in India what the case is, but I would imagine, because frankly, most countries are more rational when it comes to this sort of thing than the US is, that there are probably things in the US that are perfectly legal for the drug companies to do that would not necessarily be here.
Well, there are plenty of problems with our medical regulatory system, and there are two very good books, The Truth Pill and Bottle of Lies, if you're interested in that. But coming back to what Patrick was talking about, the third part of the story is eventually it becomes apparent that this drug is killing people across America, and it's set off this opioid crisis. It's destroying lives. When it becomes apparent that this is the case, what is the company's response and what is the state's response?
So when OxyContin is first released in 1996, it's a huge, huge hit, way beyond the expectations even of the Sackler family. It does really, really well. And I should say, part of the argument for the drug initially was there was a feeling that pain had not been treated aggressively enough. That there was because of these concerns about morphine and the opioids, that you had people who were actually suffering in terrible pain and it was undertreated. And so when the drug is initially released, there are all of these people suddenly who are able to find relief for their pain. And that is a real benefit for many of these people. And they start writing letters to the company and to the family saying, you've given me my life back. I can go back to work. I can pick up my grandchild. My life has been improved because I now have access to these drugs. But slowly they start getting another kind of letter, which is often from a parent saying, my child found one of these jumbo OxyContin pills and took it at a party, and they died. Or I was prescribed OxyContin after surgery and I started taking it, but then I found I needed it more. I was taking it more often than I was supposed to be. I feel like I'm becoming addicted to the drug. And to me, this is kind of a key moment if you think about the moral calculus of the Sackler family and of their company, Purdue Pharma. You have this product, it's helping a lot of people. It is the best-selling drug of the day. They were all very happy when it started outselling Viagra. That was kind of a big benchmark for the company. And it's generating billions and billions of dollars, just wealth on a scale that you could never have imagined. This was a wealthy family to begin with, but suddenly it's by an order of magnitude more wealthy. And suddenly you start hearing that it's killing people. And I like to think that were I in that situation, I would at least slow the train down and think, well, what are we doing here? Are we making mistakes? How can we be more careful? But they didn't do that. Instead, they made this kind of breathtaking pivot, which is when it became undeniable, when so many people were addicted to OxyContin and so many people were dying that they couldn't really deny it anymore, pretend it wasn't happening, the family and the company said, okay, yes, people are getting addicted to the drug, they're abusing it, they're dying, But the problem isn't the drug. The problem is these people. And the suggestion was these are people who have addictive personalities. They're people who abuse drugs because that's what they would be doing anyway. If they weren't abusing our drug, they'd be abusing another drug. And again, some of this is a peculiarly American story, right? Because that idea taps into an idea that I think is very core to the American identity and the American economy, which is a kind of libertarian principle that says, I can go into business and I can create a product that is very dangerous and that kills people. That it's in its nature that it does that. And I can put it out into the world and sell it and get rich selling it. And as long as somebody else is making some decision somewhere down the line after I put it into commerce, then I have no blame. Legally, I have no responsibility for what happens, and ethically, I have no responsibility because it's all about individual responsibility. Guns don't kill people, people kill people, right? Like this is a very familiar idea in America. So when the Sacklers say, drugs don't kill people, people kill people. It's these addicts, and they kind of stigmatize these people. That ends up being a fantastically successful line of argument that basically keeps them in business for an additional 10 or 15 years, because I think there's so much receptivity to that kind of point of view in American culture and American life.
They go one step further, don't they? They make use of this discovery that people are abusing the drug. They are getting rid of the coating, and because they're so desperately addicted to the drug, imbibing it, getting rid of the time release mechanism and imbibing it whole by powdering it and so on. And they're also coming to the end of their patent, so they actually use this discovery to come up with a new version of the drug, saying that, well, this cannot be destroyed. And of course, again, it's another whole bunch of lies. But what intrigued me about the story was, where does this culture of impunity really come from? Because it's not just the state, it's not just the family. We've all, I hope you guys have, but I have, and so many people have seen this wonderful documentary called All the Beauty and the Bloodshed, which documents how legendary photographer Nan Goldin, who herself was addicted to opioids for a part of her life, struggles to get the Sackler name off of the walls of major arts institutions and museums, and the resistance that she faces despite the kind of work that people like Patrick have done. Where does this culture of impunity really come from? Is that something that you could really get to the heart of, what makes the Sacklers the way they are?
Yeah, I mean, that question was very much at the heart of this whole project for me, in part because the way I came to it was I had been writing about Mexican drug cartels and the illegal drug trade. And as you may know, in the United States, we have an incarceration problem, a prison problem, beyond any other country in the world. We have 2 million people locked up. And the way we got there, really, like the only way you get to that kind of number is the war on drugs, and is the way in which we have kind of prosecuted people engaged in the illegal drug trade. So it was so fascinating to me to learn that one of the big drivers of the biggest addiction crisis of the last 3 decades was this family that not only were they not being locked up, they were celebrated. When I started writing initially an article in the New Yorker in 2017, before my book, the Sacklers, everywhere they went, were completely celebrated. It wasn't a secret that their company, Purdue Pharma, had engaged in this kind of conduct. The company had actually pled guilty to federal charges in 2007 and paid a massive, I think it was a $600 million fine. And people knew that the Sacklers owned the company, but it somehow never caught up with them. They moved through life totally unmolested by any sense that they should have to answer for this. And I sort of wanted to ask the question. I felt as though they should have to answer. And yet what I found is that we live in a system that is incredibly skewed to the wealthy, to the powerful, to the white, to the well-educated. All of the ways in which this family had sort of associated itself with elite culture, elite educational institutions, elite artistic institutions had managed to effectively launder the reputation across generations to a point where it would be very, very difficult to go after them. And when you did have authorities trying to go after them, prosecutors, for instance, in various parts of the United States, they enlisted very, very powerful people to work on their behalf. And so the first character you meet in my book is a woman named Mary Jo White, who is a very famous lawyer in the United States. She was the chairwoman of the Securities and Exchange Commission under Barack Obama. One of the most famous lawyers in the United States, worked on behalf of the Sacklers for decades. Rudy Giuliani, who now is a bit of a punchline, but at the time was considered, a potential president of the United States. Rudy Giuliani worked on behalf of the Sacklers. Eric Holder, who was the Attorney General for Barack Obama, worked on behalf of the Sacklers. They were able to enlist these elite people to essentially be their hatchet men and hatchet women. And for me, this is part of the reason that people like Nan Goldin are such heroes. And so Nan Goldin was somebody who became addicted to OxyContin. She's one of our great living American photographers, and actually ended up in rehab for OxyContin addiction in 2017. And when she came out, she picked up the New Yorker magazine and she read this article about the Sackler family, this article that I wrote. And she loved the Sackler wing at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. It was her favorite space in any museum, and she'd never connected that name was from the family that made the drug that almost killed her. And so she looked me up after the article came out, and we had a meeting in New York. We had tea, and she said, I'm going to start a campaign, and I'm going to get that name taken off of all of these museums. And I'm embarrassed to tell you that I didn't take her seriously. I didn't think she could, because they were so powerful. And I sort of said, okay, well, good luck, keep me posted. But they were so entrenched in that world that I didn't think Nan would succeed. But I underestimated her, because Nan is first of all, has a kind of unimpeachable credibility because she personally was addicted to OxyContin, right? She's somebody who's been addicted to the drug. And also, she's a very important artist. And so in the worlds where the Sacklers wanted to have influence, the worlds of these museums, all of these museums held Nan's artworks in their collections. So there's a moment where the National Portrait Gallery in London wanted to run a Nan Goldin retrospective, and she said, sure, I'll let you run a retrospective if you take the Sackler name down, if you stop taking money from the Sacklers. And then the third thing about Nan is that she had, yeah, absolutely, here. And she succeeded. I mean, the third thing I was going to say is that she had been an activist in the 1990s because she experienced the AIDS crisis, and she was very involved in activism around AIDS. And so you have these three qualities which made her kind of a superhero, it turns out. And so she was able to go out and have these fantastic protests. I describe them in the book, but at all of these museums that the Met, at the Guggenheim, at the Louvre, and she eventually succeeds one by one in having the Sackler name taken down. And we're now at a point where none of these institutions, I mean, there are still some, I should say, but very few of these institutions will take take Sackler money.
The book is, the story in itself is so fascinating that sometimes we forget that it's about something much, much larger. In fact, I'd heard one of the interviews in which you were talking about, like you said, Eric Holder, Rudy Giuliani, what led these people, again, the way you document soft corruption, how it works in America and most large democracy, including ours, is absolutely fascinating. But Patrick, when I look at your body of work, when I look at Snakehead and Say Nothing and some of the essays, all of the essays and Rogues, and of course this wonderful book, at times I'm just bedazzled by how diverse your body of work is, and then at other times I can see a pattern. But I was wondering if there is a kind of story, the world is full of stories, so what is the kind of story that draws you to itself? And I don't want to misquote, so I'm going to read this out, but a profile of yours said, sorry, I'm being rather clumsy with the paper, it can sometimes seem as though Keefe's interest in a subject is proportional to the reporting difficulties it presents. And I couldn't agree more because I've read all of your work. But does feasibility and of getting to the truth of the matter concern you when you take on a subject?
I mean, of course feasibility concerns me. I wouldn't say that I'm drawn to a subject just because it seems difficult to report on. No. It's always a thing you think about. I mean, I don't, I think I probably have an almost childlike sense where, you know, if you hold something in your hand behind your back, I want to know what it is. And so if there's a secret out there, I want to try and find some way to prize it free. In terms of how I choose the stories, I mean, honestly, I wish I had a system. I can tell you that I never start with an issue. I never, ever. I have colleagues at the New Yorker who will look at a particular issue, a legal issue, a social issue, a scientific issue, a cultural issue, and then it's almost as if they're like a casting director in a movie, for a movie, and they know the topic, and then they need to kind of cast the story. They need to find the person who will be their way in. And I think it's a great way of working. I don't work that way. I always start with the human story. I think that I think we're just kind of hardwired as humans to process information better if it's told to us as a yarn, as a narrative. I certainly for me, and I would imagine it's true for some of you as well. You know, my oldest memories, my first memories in life are of lying next to my mother in bed as she told me a story or read me a story. And I think that there's a way in which, certainly as a reader, I love nothing more than when I open a magazine or a newspaper or I open a book and you get that feeling that you're in good hands. Somebody's got, you know, they're sort of slowly dealing out the cards to you. They've given thought to how they're going to do this. And I love that kind of, I think of it as like undertow when you're at the beach and you feel the undertow kind of pulling you in. That feeling that you're kind of helpless. And so that's what I'm always trying to create for the reader, but also it means that when I'm moving through life, I'm very, very attuned to what makes me, you know, if we're talking and you suddenly mention some story, what makes me kind of lean forward and want to know more? There's a piece for the New Yorker that I've been working on since August, which is coming out tomorrow. I hope you'll all look for it. And I was having a conversation with a guy in August in London, and we'd been talking for about half an hour about various things, and then he said, oh, you know, I have these friends, and there's a crazy thing that happened to them. And he told me what it was, and I immediately just kind of, I was so gripped by what he said that I said, where are these friends? Can I meet them? And a few days later I did, and here we are 5 months later. I've been talking to these friends of his every day for 5 months and wrote this massive piece about them. So I don't have a system per se. It's that I kind of try and listen to my own gut in a way.
My final question to you, Patrick, before we open this up is that we live in times when you know, journalism is a profession that is looked upon with suspicion. It brings about polarization in conversations. But people, journalists like you, are, to my mind, flag bearers of what can be absolutely glorious about being a journalist. And you make it look easy because you write these wonderful books that read so well. But I wonder if you've struggled with dealing with sort of ethical quandaries that come up when you're reporting. Ours is a profession that is not subject to strict regulatory codes, and for very good reason. I'm glad it's not, but that also kind of means that you need to have your own set of rules and principles that you abide by. So that's one part of the question. And the next part of the question is that what do you see as the role of the journalist? Is it simply to chronicle the times that we live in and where we've come from? Or is it, or does it go beyond that to try and provide a sort of moral compass to society and culture?
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there, but I'll talk fast. I'll take the last part first. What is the role of the journalist? I mean, I think that there are many different ways of scoping out the work, and I think that we want all of them. We want many different people doing different types of work. My boss at the New Yorker, David Remnick, has said that he thinks that it is the role of the journalist to hold power to account. And I don't think that's the only role of the journalist. I think that there's many, many kinds of journalism that don't necessarily do that and are wonderful and important. But I do think of that as part of what I'm trying to do. And on some level, I think that if you're a journalist and you don't feel a little bit uncomfortable around power and a little bit skeptical about power, then you're probably not doing your job. You should rethink it a bit. In terms of the difficulties, listen, one thing I should say is I'm speaking to you from a position of incredible privilege, right? I go around the world, I write stories in other countries, and I'm very, very aware that I'm a staff writer at the New Yorker. I've been there for a long time. I can write, this piece that's coming out tomorrow is 14,000 words, right? And I got half a year to write it, and a budget in which I could go back and forth to England where the story takes place. And that's rare. All of that is rare, and I'm aware that a lot of what we do is kind of endangered. And in many countries where I've reported, it's actually, you can get killed being a journalist, right? Not so much me, because I can leave. I have the luxury of a U.S. passport and I can fly away. But in Mexico, for instance, where I've reported, it's an incredibly dangerous job. And I think there's a heroism in the work that journalists do, and it should be, we should. We should respect it, and we should reward it by subscribing to publications that we read, and not just taking it for granted that these people will go out there and bring back the truth, and we can get it for free with a click. On ethical quandaries, yes, I'm very mindful of them, in part because I'm often writing in a fairly critical register about the ethical lapses of other people, and so it would be pretty hypocritical for me not to turn that lens on myself. Every single time I write a story, there will be some ethical issue that I'm wrestling with. Often they're kind of vanishingly subtle issues. But to give you a recent example, there's a guy that I was dealing with on this London story there's a person I'm trying to get the truth out of, and he won't tell me the truth. He keeps lying to me. And I know some things about that guy that he wouldn't want out there in the world. And another of the sources that I have for this story, who's a bit of a gangster, he told me, well, you should just blackmail him. Tell him that if he doesn't tell you the truth, you're going to publish all of his worst secrets. And I was trying to explain to him, I can't, that would be hugely unethical of me. As badly as I want the truth, I can't tell the guy, if you don't give me X, Y, and Z, I'll publish Q. So yes, I wrestle with those types of questions all the time, and I think if they weren't front of mind, it would sort of be malpractice.
We have about 6 minutes, so I imagine we can take about 3 or 4 questions. We have one right up front. Because there are so many of you here and such little time, I will urge you to please keep your questions very, very crisp. Thank you. And ask just one question per person.
Thank you very much. Absolutely brilliant. Do you think the Sackler money can ever be redeemed? So in the UK, there is a Sackler Trust that gives money away. It no longer requires its name to be even published in a charity's annual report. Is there some argument that actually to put it into education, into criminal justice, into social justice issues is the right thing, or is there an alternative solution and we should none of us touch that money at all?
It's a great question. I should say, I think of myself, in terms of my lane, I think of myself as a journalist. I'm not an activist. It's not my job to tell any institution what they should or shouldn't do. I worked sort of in parallel with Nan Goldin, but I was always very clear that she was kind of engaged in a different thing than I was. My issue is, let's all be honest about what's happening. And so part of the issue with the Sacklers was that I think a lot of these institutions were taking the money and they knew that it was dirty money, and they sort of hoped nobody would notice. If you have an institution, I've talked to, for instance, people who do cancer research, and they got money from the Sacklers, and they said, I do not care where the money comes from. $1 is $1, and I want to cure cancer. And that's the math that I've done, and so I will continue to take the money. So I think the big issue for me is if you have organizations taking the money moving forward, they shouldn't be doing it anonymously. Make the case, and there are some museums, I think this is true actually of the Smithsonian, where they have, what they've done is they've renamed those Sackler spaces, or they've kept the Sackler name, but they have a plaque which says, we're going to give you the real truth about the Sacklers. Here's who this family really is, and you can actually read an informational plaque that talks about the history of OxyContin and what have you. And I think that's a really creative way of doing it. Again, it's not for me to tell anyone any institution how they should behave. Where I have a problem is when people sort of behave a certain way and their behavior is predicated on the truth not being out there. Let's all acknowledge what the truth is, and then you can decide how you're going to behave vis-a-vis your constituents. Once it's out there and we all kind of agree on the facts.
I have no idea who has the mic and who's passing. Yeah, could you pass it there, please? Thank you.
I've brought the weather with me, folks.
First of all, when I heard about the Nan Golden, the campaign that she ran, it kind of brought tears to my eyes, and I'd never heard of it before. My question very quickly is, since you report around ethical issues, have you ever reported on a story where the power of money or capitalism doesn't win?
Oh, what a good question. So in terms of the Nan story, you should really watch this documentary called All the Beauty and the Bloodshed, which is all about her and her campaign. It's great. I'd recommend it. I think money almost always wins. I do. And even in the Sackler case, I'll give you an illustration. When the name finally came down at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which is the biggest deal of all, it was the one that Nan really wanted to see the name go down on. And I was there with her that morning. It was an amazing moment, and it felt like a real triumph. And then there was an article in the New York Times about it, and you had to get down sort of 8 or 10 paragraphs in the story, and then it said, this creates an almost unprecedented naming opportunity in New York City. So like other people with lots of money, here's your chance. The Sackler wing is no longer the Sackler wing. Who will we take donations from now? I wrote a story for the New Yorker some time ago about all the sanctions on Russian oligarchs and how they were having to give up their properties in London. And it said that there are all of these Chinese buyers who are ready to swoop in and buy the homes that have been liberated from the Russian oligarchs. So I'm afraid that I can't think of a story that I've done in which money doesn't win in the end. I hate to say.
Well, I suppose it also depends on how you define wins and justice, and the Sacklers, they're still out there. But the story has been written by Patrick. The book is available. We know the truth. We're discussing the truth, and that's also a win. Can we have it up front?
As I'm reading your book, the way in which you write about Richard Sackler and Arthur Sackler, it's in a very unbiased tone. How do you prevent yourself from putting personal opinions into your book?
Good question. I do have personal opinions, right? And I think if you look closely, you can sort of tell how I feel about people often. The trick for me is I want to get as close to the people I'm writing about as possible, even if they're awful people who've done terrible things. I think that there's a way in which we often talk about bad people who've done bad things, which is a little bit self-flattering, right? Where you look at some criminal, you look at some person you read about in the newspaper, and you say, well, that person has nothing to do with me. I would never be like, that's an evil person. That they kind of exist apart from who I am. And I'm much more interested in finding the humanity of these people who do bad things, finding the way in which they actually are kind of like you, the ways in which you might relate to them that would be sort of uncomfortable to think about. And so the answer for me is always get as close as you can. With the Sacklers, none of them talked to me when I was working on this book. In fact, they were threatening to sue me the whole time I wrote the book. But I very much wanted you, when you were reading it, not to feel like you were looking at them through a telescope, but as though you were right in the room with them, that you could see them up close.
I'm sorry, that's all the time we have. The buzzer has gone off, but I recommend that you buy Patrick's books and you read them. It feels like having a conversation with him. He's also going to be signing books, so if you're picking them up, you have an opportunity to speak with him and get the book signed. Thank you very much for being
Thank you,
such a
Pragya.
wonderful audience, and
Thank you all. Thank you so much.
Subscribe to One India channel and never miss an update.